When Mao Zedong stood atop the gate of heavenly peace on October 1st, 1949, and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, the United States watched with a mixture of disappointment and quiet dread. The loss of China, as American politicians bitterly called it, sent shockwaves through Washington. For decades, the United States had imagined China as a vast frontier of opportunity, a market of 400 million souls waiting to buy American goods, a nation to be shaped by missionaries, traders, and the promise of democracy. Now that dream had collapsed into the hands of communism, and the fear that would haunt America for the next 70 years was born in that single moment. In the years that followed, China was a broken and impoverished nation. The Civil War had devastated its cities, famine stalked its countryside, and the world's most populous country was, by almost every measure, one of its poorest. Yet, even in weakness, China frightened America. When Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River into Korea in 1950, throwing back American forces who had believed themselves invincible, Washington learned a hard lesson. This was not a nation to be dismissed. Tens of thousands of American soldiers died in the frozen hills of Korea, and the war ended not in victory, but in stalemate. The image of endless waves of Chinese soldiers willing to sacrifice everything seared itself into the American imagination. Through the 1950s and 1960s, China seemed locked in self-destruction. Mao's Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, was meant to transform China into an industrial power overnight. Instead, it produced one of the deadliest famines in human history, claiming tens of millions of lives. Backyard furnaces melted down useful tools to make worthless iron, while peasants starved in the fields. Then came the Cultural Revolution in 1966, a decade of chaos in which students turned against teachers, children denounced parents, and the nation tore itself apart in the name of ideological purity. To American observers, China appeared to be a giant consuming itself, no threat to anyone but its own people. Yet beneath the chaos, something was changing that would terrify Washington far more than any famine. In October 1964, China detonated its first atomic bomb in the deserts of Lop Nur. A nation that could barely feed its people had joined the nuclear club. By 1967, it had tested a hydrogen bomb. The poorest of the great powers now held the ultimate weapon, and it answered to no one. The Soviet Union, once China's communist ally, had become its bitter rival, and the two giants nearly went to war along their shared border in 1969. America watched these developments with growing unease, realizing that China was not simply a Soviet satellite, but an independent force with its own ambitions and its own will. It was this realization that drove one of the most dramatic diplomatic reversals in history. In 1972, President Richard Nixon, a man who had built his entire political career on fierce anti-communism, flew to Beijing to shake the hand of Mao Zedong. The image stunned the world. Nixon understood something profound. A rising China, however poor and chaotic, could not be ignored or contained forever. Better to engage it, to pull it away from the Soviet Union, to bring it into the international order where its behavior might be shaped. This was the week that changed the world, Nixon declared. He was more right than he knew, though not in the way he intended. The American fear of China in these early decades was not yet the fear of an economic rival or a technological competitor. It was a deeper, more primal anxiety, the fear of the unknown, the fear of a civilization so ancient and so vast that it operated by rules America did not understand. Here was a nation of immense population, immense history, and immense potential, and it had chosen a path utterly opposed to American values. The sheer scale of China, its endurance through catastrophe after catastrophe, suggested a patience and resilience that no obstacle could break. America had defeated fascism and was containing communism in Europe, but China was something different, a sleeping giant that had survived for thousands of years and would survive for thousands more. By the time Mao died in 1976, China stood at a crossroads. The revolutionary fervor had exhausted itself. The economy was in ruins, and a new generation of leaders was preparing to chart a different course. America, distracted by Vietnam and the Cold War with Moscow, did not yet grasp what was coming. The giant had stumbled through 3 decades of turmoil, but had not fallen. It had endured, it had armed itself, and it was about to awaken in a way that would transform the world and confirm America's deepest fears. The sleeping giant was opening its eyes, and the 20th century would never be the same. In December 1978, a small, soft-spoken man who had been purged and rehabilitated 3 times during his political life rose to power in China. Deng Xiaoping was not a charismatic revolutionary like Mao. He was a pragmatist, famous for declaring that it did not matter whether a cat was black or white, so long as it caught mice. With those words, Deng launched a transformation that would reshape the entire world and awaken American fears in an entirely new dimension. China would no longer destroy itself in the name of ideology. It would build, it would trade, and it would grow. The change began quietly in the countryside, where farmers were allowed to sell their surplus crops for profit. Production soared almost overnight. Then came the special economic zones, experimental capitalist enclaves in cities like Shenzhen, which in 1980 was a sleepy fishing village of 30,000 people. Within a few decades, it would become a glittering metropolis of millions, a forest of skyscrapers and factories rivaling any city on Earth. Foreign investment poured in, drawn by an endless supply of cheap, disciplined labor. Western corporations, hungry for profit, eagerly built their factories on Chinese soil, transferring technology and know-how with each passing year. America watched this transformation with a curious blend of optimism and blindness. The prevailing belief in Washington was comforting and seductive. As China grew rich, it would inevitably grow free. Capitalism would bring democracy. A prosperous middle class would demand political rights, and China would gradually become more like America. This theory, repeated endlessly by presidents and pundits alike, justified decades of engagement. American companies flocked to China. American consumers filled their homes with Chinese-made goods, and American leaders assured themselves that they were taming the dragon by feeding it. But the world received a brutal warning in June 1989, when pro-democracy demonstrators filled Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing, demanding the very freedoms America had predicted would come. The Chinese government answered not with reform, but with tanks. The crackdown shocked the world. The image of a lone man standing defiantly before a column of tanks became an enduring symbol of courage. But the deeper lesson was darker. The Communist Party had chosen survival over liberalization. It would embrace economic growth while crushing political dissent without mercy. America had misread China profoundly, yet the engagement continued, for the profits were simply too great to abandon. Throughout the 1990s, China's economy grew at a breathtaking pace, often exceeding 10% a year. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in the largest and fastest economic expansion in human history. Cities rose from rice paddies. Highways and railways stretched across the land. The Chinese learned, adapted, and improved upon everything the West taught them. They did not merely assemble products designed elsewhere. They began to master the technologies themselves, building an industrial base of staggering scale and sophistication. American manufacturing felt the consequences. Factory towns across the American heartland began to hollow out as production moved overseas. Steel mills closed, textile plants shuttered, and entire communities that had thrived for generations fell into decline. The cheap goods filling American shelves came at a hidden cost. The erosion of the industrial foundation that had made America the arsenal of democracy. For a time, this trade-off seemed acceptable, even beneficial, as American consumers enjoyed lower prices and American corporations reaped enormous profits. Few understood that the balance of economic power was quietly shifting across the Pacific. China's leaders, meanwhile, pursued a deliberate strategy that Deng had famously summarized. Hide your strength, bide your time. China would not provoke confrontation. It would not boast of its ambitions. It would grow quietly, patiently, accumulating wealth and capability while presenting itself to the world as a developing nation seeking only peaceful cooperation. This patience was strategic genius. While America focused on the Soviet collapse, the Gulf War, and the dawn of the Internet age, China steadily built the foundations of a superpower, brick by brick, factory by factory, year by year. By the end of the 1990s, the question of China's entry into the World Trade Organization dominated international debate. American leaders argued passionately that bringing China into the global trading system would bind it to international rules and accelerate its political liberalization. In 2001, China formally joined the WTO, gaining full access to global markets. It was hailed as a triumph of engagement, the final step in integrating China into the American-led world order. In reality, it was the moment the floodgates opened. The Great Transformation was complete, and a new chapter was about to begin, one in which America's comfortable assumptions would shatter against the hard reality of a rising rival that had no intention of becoming anything other than itself. The new millennium opened with America's attention fixed elsewhere. On September 11th, 2001, terrorist attacks transformed American foreign policy overnight. For the next decade, the United States poured its blood, treasure, and strategic focus into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, into the global hunt for terrorists, into a struggle against an enemy that hid in caves and crowded cities. While America was thus distracted, consumed by a war on terror that would cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, China seized the opportunity to grow without interference. History would later judge this decade as the moment America took its eyes off the true rising power. China's economy in these years did not merely grow, it exploded. Having joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, China became the workshop of the world. Its exports flooded every market on Earth. The phrase "made in China" appeared on virtually everything Americans touched, from toys to electronics to the steel in their bridges. China's gross domestic product, which had been a fraction of America's, climbed relentlessly. It surpassed France, then Britain, then Germany, and in 2010 it overtook Japan to become the second largest economy in the world. The speed of this ascent had no precedent in human history. The world received a stunning visual demonstration of China's arrival in August 2008, when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. The opening ceremony was a spectacle of overwhelming grandeur, thousands of performers moving in perfect synchronization, dazzling technology, and a display of national confidence that left billions of viewers awestruck. This was no longer the impoverished, chaotic China of the Mao era. This was a nation announcing to the world that it had arrived, that it was modern, powerful, and proud. For many Americans watching at home, the ceremony stirred an uneasy feeling that the global order was shifting beneath their feet. That same year, A financial catastrophe struck the heart of the American economy. The 2008 financial crisis brought Wall Street to its knees, wiped out trillions in wealth, and plunged the United States into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The crisis shattered American confidence and damaged the prestige of the American economic model around the world. China, by contrast, weathered the storm with remarkable resilience. Its government unleashed a massive stimulus program, building infrastructure on a colossal scale and keeping its economy growing while the West struggled to recover. To many observers, the crisis marked a turning point, the moment when American invincibility began to fade and Chinese strength became undeniable. China used these years to accumulate enormous financial power. It became the largest holder of American government debt, lending vast sums to the United States to finance its deficits and wars. This created a strange and uncomfortable interdependence. America depended on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese credit, while China depended on American consumers to buy its goods. Some called it a financial balance of terror, a relationship so intertwined that neither could easily break free. Yet the underlying trend was clear. America was the borrower, and China was increasingly the lender. The debtor and creditor relationship carried profound implications for the future balance of power. Beyond economics, China began to extend its reach across the globe. It poured investment into Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, building roads, ports, railways, and mines in exchange for access to the raw materials its industries craved. Chinese diplomats and businessmen appeared in places where America had long held influence, offering loans and infrastructure with no lectures about democracy or human rights. To developing nations, China presented an attractive alternative, a partner that delivered tangible results without political conditions. Slowly, patiently, China was building a network of influence that spanned the entire developing world. China also began to modernize its military with steady determination. For decades, its armed forces have been vast, but technologically backward. Now, fueled by economic growth, China invested heavily in modern ships, aircraft, missiles, and cyber capabilities. It began to assert claims over the South China Sea, one of the world's most vital waterways, through which trillions of dollars in trade passed each year. American military planners, long accustomed to unquestioned dominance in the Pacific, began to notice that the balance of power in the region was no longer guaranteed. The rival was not only getting richer, it was getting stronger. Yet through all of this, American policy remained largely committed to engagement. Successive administrations continued to hope that China would become a responsible stakeholder in the international system, that economic integration would moderate its behavior, that prosperity would eventually bring openness. There were warnings, voices that cautioned about the rising challenge, but they were drowned out by the immense profits of trade and the lingering faith in the old theory. By 2012, as a new and ambitious leader prepared to take command in Beijing, the comfortable illusions of the engagement era were about to face their final and most decisive test. The rival had fully emerged, and America was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what it faced. In 2012, a new leader took the helm of China, and the cautious era of hiding strength and biding time came to an abrupt end. Xi Jinping was unlike his predecessors. He was confident, assertive, and unapologetic about China's ambitions. He spoke openly of the Chinese dream, a vision of national rejuvenation that would restore China to what he believed was its rightful place at the center of the world. Under his leadership, China abandoned the modest posture of Deng Xiaoping and stepped boldly onto the global stage as a power that would no longer accept a secondary role. For America, the comfortable illusions of the engagement era finally shattered. She launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, an immense undertaking to build infrastructure across Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. Trillions of dollars flowed into ports, railways, highways, and power plants in dozens of nations. It was the most ambitious economic project in history, a modern Silk Road designed to place China at the center of global commerce. Critics warned that it created debt traps, ensnaring poorer nations in obligations they could never repay, giving China leverage over their politics and resources. Whatever the truth, the initiative announced China's intention to reshape the global economic order in its own image. The technological dimension of the rivalry became the new battlefield. China no longer wished to be the world's low-cost factory. It set out to dominate the industries of the future: artificial intelligence, telecommunications, electric vehicles, semiconductors, and renewable energy. The Made in China 2025 plan declared an explicit goal of achieving technological supremacy. Chinese companies like Huawei rose to lead the world in next-generation wireless technology, raising alarms in Washington that China might control the digital infrastructure of the entire planet. America suddenly confronted the possibility that its long technological dominance, the very foundation of its military and economic supremacy, could be overtaken. These fears erupted into open conflict during the trade war that began in 2018. The United States imposed sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods, accusing China of stealing intellectual property, forcing technology transfers, and engaging in unfair trade practices. China retaliated with tariffs of its own. The two largest economies in the world, so deeply intertwined for decades, began a painful process of confrontation and decoupling. American policy underwent a historic shift, abandoning the engagement strategy that had guided it for 40 years and embracing instead a posture of strategic competition. Both major political parties in America, so divided on almost everything else, found rare agreement that China represented the central challenge of the age. The global pandemic that began in late 2019 poured fuel on the fire. As the virus spread from China across the world, killing millions and devastating economies, accusations and recriminations flew between Washington and Beijing. The crisis exposed how dependent America had become on Chinese manufacturing, as shortages of medical supplies and critical goods revealed the vulnerability of supply chains that stretched across the Pacific. Public opinion in America turned sharply against China. What had once been an economic and strategic rivalry now carried a deep current of distrust and resentment that permeated society itself. The most dangerous flashpoint of all remained the island of Taiwan. China regarded this self-governing democracy as a renegade province that must eventually be reunited with the mainland, by force if necessary. The United States, while not formally recognizing Taiwan's independence, had long pledged to help it defend itself. As China's military grew ever more powerful and its rhetoric ever more aggressive, the possibility of a direct confrontation over Taiwan loomed as the nightmare scenario, a conflict that could draw the world's two greatest powers into a catastrophic war. Taiwan also produced the most advanced semiconductors on Earth, making the stakes higher still for whoever controlled that technology might control the future. By the present day, the rivalry between America and China had become the defining contest of the 21st century. It was a competition fought across every domain: economic, technological, military, diplomatic, and ideological. It was a struggle between two visions of how the world should be ordered, between democracy and authoritarianism, between an established superpower determined to preserve its leadership and a rising one determined to claim its place. Historians spoke of the Thucydides Trap, the ancient observation that when a rising power challenges an established one, war often follows. The question that hung over the world was whether America and China could escape that trap. America's fear of China, born in the moment of communist victory in 1949, had completed a remarkable evolution. It had begun as fear of an ideological enemy, transformed into anxiety over an economic competitor, and matured into a profound strategic apprehension about losing global supremacy itself. The sleeping giant had not merely awakened. It had risen to challenge the very foundations of American power. Whether this great contest would end in conflict or coexistence, in war or in some uneasy balance, remained the most consequential question of the age. What was certain was that the world had entered a new era, one defined by the rise of China and the fear it inspired in the nation that had stood alone at the summit for so long. The reckoning had arrived, and its outcome would shape the destiny of all humanity.